All right, welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. First thing I like to do every week is poll the membership to see if there are any news and notes from anybody working on any projects or anything going on out there. Bill, could I bend your ear for just a moment? You had put out something about needing writers for the White Sox book that's upcoming. How is that going?
That's going pretty good. We're going to try to get that book out early next year. And I don't think we actually need anybody at the moment.
Okay.
We've got a couple of people come in.
Excellent. What other books are in the pipeline that people can help with?
With a long deadline, we need an author for Al Martin for the 2001 Mariners. We need 3 or 4 authors, perhaps, for a book on Native American ball players. I'm waiting to hear confirmations from some people that seem to have disappeared. There's always something. If you're anxious to write a bio and appear in print and have the glory of being in a SABR book, just drop me a line and I'll try to see what's available.
What's that email address, Bill?
It just changed, but it's always in the SABR directory. Right now it's very complicated. It's bill@downtheroadrecords.com.
Yes.
17-letter domain name, Down the Road Records. But it's in the SABR directory.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to take a moment to urge all of you to add the podcast Ordinary Effort to your podcatchers list today. Hosted by chapter member Josh DeVries, the show is about 2 random baseball fans trying not to biff, whatever that means, immaculate grid. They reminisce about their favorite players and share baseball memories while playing for the lowest rarity score. There's a link to the podcast in our YouTube channel for quick access, and there's also one for baseball and barbecue too, our friends Jeff and Len. Have a listen to some great work by some of SABR's finest members. All right, now on to our feature presentation. Before there were the White Sox, or Stockings, before there was an American League, Charles Comiskey owned a professional baseball team. In this presentation, we'll trace Comiskey's path as team owner in the Western League between 1895 and 1900. Aided by his longtime friend Ban Johnson, who had been a Cincinnati journalist while Comiskey played first base with the Reds, Comiskey bought the Sioux City club in the Western League and immediately moved it to St. Paul. It was in Minnesota's capital city that Comiskey honed his skills at building and running a baseball club, while also pressing to locate a ballpark for his club to play in. The lessons he learned at St. Paul soon made Comiskey a leading voice in the major leagues. John Bauer is our chapter secretary and resides with his wife and 2 children in Bedford, New Hampshire. By day, he is senior vice president and general counsel of an insurance company headquartered in Manchester with specialties in corporate and regulatory law. By night, he spends many spring and summer evenings staying up way too late to watch the San Francisco Giants, and he is a year-round avid reader of baseball, history, and baseball history. He is a past and ongoing contributor to various SABR projects, and he is here tonight to give his presentation. John Bauer, how you doing?
I am well. How are you, Bruce? How's everybody?
Great.
All right. Well, let's see if we can pull this off in terms of sharing the presentation. All right.
Good.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Is that excellent? Okay. I had a presentation last week. I was for a different group, nothing baseball related, and had an issue sharing. So glad to see that the kinks have been worked out. But want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, for listening to me talk when there's meaningful playoff baseball being played. Appreciate the time, particularly because this research project started like most research projects I undertake. There's something that interests me, and I think in some cases it may interest only me. But I just want to dig into something, and the formation of the Western League and the path to the American League is just one of those stories that had fascinated me as a baseball fan and an amateur baseball historian. So I got into the topic of Charlie Comiskey, St. Paul, and the road to the American League and to Chicago. And this was The presentation you're going to see is one that I gave in Minneapolis during SABR 52, and Bruce asked me to share the presentation tonight. So very happy to do so. And so the story where I'm going to pick up the story is, Charlie Comiskey is in Cincinnati in the early 1890s. Now, Comiskey had been a captain and first baseman for the St. Louis Brown Stockings teams that had won 4 straight American League pennants in the American Association in the 1880s. Comiskey went back to his hometown, Chicago, when the Players League came into being, and then went back to St. Louis after the Players League folded. The owner of the Cincinnati Reds at that time, John Brush, and this is a name that we will hear again in the course of this presentation. He was the owner of the Reds, and he gave Comiskey a contract to manage the Reds. And Comiskey was a player manager while he was there. Although his playing career, his time became more of a part-time player toward the end. And he had middling success as a manager. He finished around, remember there were 12 teams in the National League at this time, so the team finished right around the middle for his first couple of years and then slid into 10th place in 1894. And with his contract in Cincinnati about up, Comiskey was looking for new opportunities and also was looking to perhaps be his own boss and looking into possible ownership. And it just so happened that there was a new baseball league around this time, and he had some influence in creating it. And so this was his opportunity to move up. And this is where the Western League comes into being. Now, the Western League, one of the things in the course of researching this is that there were probably, I counted at least 4 different leagues in the late 1800s that had either Western League or Western Association in their moniker. This is the Western League that started play in 1894. And this is the league that would morph into the American League at the turn of the century. Now, the Western League began play in 1894, but if you remember, Comiskey was still in Cincinnati at that time managing the Reds. During his time managing the Reds, he befriended a local sports editor for the Commercial Gazette named Ban Johnson. Now, Ban Johnson was someone who he had a vision of a different sort of baseball, one in which there was respect for umpires, there was less rough play, there was less drunkenness, less profanity, and an environment where women and children would feel comfortable coming to ball games. Now, Ban Johnson, there are various stories about how he became the president of the Western League. One of those is that John Brush, the owner of the Reds, hated him so much that if he thought he got him out of Cincinnati, writing about him, that it would be good for John Brush. There are also cases where a well-placed bug in some influential owner's ear from Charlie Comiskey helped to facilitate Ban Johnson's ascension to the presidency of the Western League. And so Johnson is elected the president of the league. And this league is primarily centered in the Midwest. And for those of you who think about the American Association of the first half of the 20th century, this league occupied a very similar footprint. And in fact, there are some cities that overlap. So the league is centered in the Midwest. And in its first year of existence, its Sioux City franchise, which was its smallest outpost and had by far the smallest attendance, won the pennant. But the league really didn't want to be in Sioux City, partly because of the attendance, partly because of it being the farthest outpost from the other cities in the league. So the league had planned to drop Sioux City for the 1895 season, and there were possible replacement cities, including Chicago, Columbus, and then St. Paul. Comiskey led the St. Paul effort. And he said that his plan was to own and manage the club. He made a statement, "I am the enterprise alone." Well, there's some discussion about whether Comiskey had behind the scenes help, but he did end up winning the spot for St. Paul at the Western League meetings. And then even though he had not set foot in St. Paul for years, he arrives a couple of weeks later to begin hunting for a place to play. And he set up shop at the Windsor Hotel in St. Paul. And the spot of land that he found to serve as his grounds is this area that became known as Aurora Park. And it's Aurora Park because one of the streets that bounded the territory was Aurora Street. It's also known, and I think by its SABR ballpark biography, is the Dale in Aurora Park. I'm going to call it Aurora Park because that's simpler to say. So Comiskey finds his land, and his father will oversee the construction of a small park with a 2,000-seat grandstand with 1,200 seats of bleachers. And with the uniforms, in terms of what they would wear, the team had uniform combinations over the years. There was some discussion early on of a white uniform with red trim, but there's also this gray uniform with black trim with St. Paul and block letterings. Those are the two looks that the team seemed to adopt during the course of their time in St. Paul, although there was a navy blue uniform for a period of time there, just to give you a visual image of how the team looked on the field. But one thing I will note is that before their first exhibition game, as the players were headed to Cincinnati to play an exhibition game against the Reds, Comiskey had to stop off in Chicago to pick up the uniforms so that his team would have something to play in. So he had that little detour to make sure that his team would be outfitted for their first exhibition games. And, Comiskey kept several players from the Sioux City team when he took over when he formed the club. And I guess why wouldn't he? They were a team that was coming off of a pennant. They also had the batting champion from the prior year, outfielder Lefty Marr, had hit 387 for them. So the team seems to be set up pretty decently. Also, Comiskey signs pitcher Tony Mullane, who had a long major league career in which he won 284 games. He'd even played for Comiskey for a time in Cincinnati. But he's in his mid-30s and nearing the end of his career, but he does hook up with Comiskey in St. Paul. So the early returns from the exhibitions in Cincinnati, one thing to note is that the team really hadn't played together or even practiced together very much before these exhibition games, and it probably showed. They were beaten by the Reds 14-4 and 6-0. So, the little bit of a take that to their former manager. But when they returned to St. Paul to begin preparing for the season, they would play games against local outfits such as the Pickets. They also had 2 exhibition games against the famous Page Fence Giants with Bud Fowler. The Saints took both of those games, but they dropped 2 out of 3 against Minneapolis in preseason exhibitions. But Comiskey is feeling pretty good about the team, and he's drumming up support. And as you can see, he says, "I have no hesitation assuring the people of St. Paul that they have no reason to be ashamed of the men who wear the gray and black." So early days of the season, one thing I just wanted to note is as many of you know, team nicknames evolved, particularly in the 1890s. And there was an article in April of 1895 that said the team would be known as the Comiskey Saints, or the Comiskey's Saints, which harkened back to, I guess, Ward's Wonders or Kelly's Killers from the Players League era. But the names Comiskey Saints, Saints and Apostles, Comiskey Saints really didn't seem to take hold, and the team would be known interchangeably as the Saints and Apostles during the course of their time in St. Paul. I'm going to call them Saints here, but just be advised that those that those names were both used in reference to the team. So they have their season opener and they win. They beat Kansas City. They come home for their home opener, and with Tony Mullane on the mound and Comiskey at first, they end up beating Milwaukee. I will note that Comiskey, he had, in the course of owning the team and managing the team, I guess he could do 2 out of 3 things well, but playing was something that eluded him. And there was a reference to the fact that he had not looked after himself or had been taking up his training, because one newspaper said that he had the look of a well-fed banker rather than a ball commander. But Comiskey was on the field for that first game in St. Paul. And they have, and things are, they got off to a decent start, but then one of the things that would be a theme with the Saints is they would have disastrous road trips, and their very first Eastern road trip really set the tone, such that they ended up sinking to last place at the end of the month. And Comiskey he spent a lot of time as a winner, so he expressed his frustration and planned to make some changes to the roster. Now, I want to interject about Sunday baseball because this is an issue where the playing on the Sabbath was an issue for many teams, both at the major league and minor league level during this era, and St. Paul was not exempt from that. Now, even though the mayor of St. Paul had said that he had no objection to Sunday games, there were others who did. And there was a certain Reverend Charles Edgar Haupt who obtained a temporary injunction that was later continued, arguing that baseball was a public nuisance. And so the concern was for Comiskey is that he had just spent several $1,000s building this park, and now he has to potentially look for another place to play. At one point, he expressed some frustration and talked about moving the team to Columbus. He did not do that, obviously, but he did end up finding a spot called the West Side Grounds where he could play Sunday games. So for the first couple of seasons in St. Paul, you'll see they play their Sunday games at the West Side Grounds, which was far away from any homes and churches, or at least not many around, and then played the rest of their games at the Aurora Park. And the first season, is a reasonably good finish. The team, after that Eastern road trip that saw them sink to 8-18, they came home and they started winning. They won 12 out of 13. So just like that, they're over 500. The fans respond. They have consecutive Saturday games with attendance over 6,000. And they end the month of July, in third place after that rough start. They're within striking distance of first place, but once again, there's another tough road trip is their undoing. They go to Indiana. They drop 5 out of 8 to Terre Haute in Indianapolis. So they end up finishing second to Indianapolis. And I'll note that there's a lot of finger pointing at this time at John Brush and the team that was called Cincinnati. Now, I mentioned that Brush owned Cincinnati. He also owned Indianapolis in the Western League. And Brush would shuttle players between Cincinnati and Indianapolis where he could find advantage. And this would obviously cause some friction in the league and would lead to some attempts to get some rule changes to stop that practice or put some constraints on it. After the season, Comiskey became a barnstormer, and this ended up being his first and only time that he ended up barnstorming when he was with St. Paul. The team begins a western trek through the Dakotas and Montana, heading to the West Coast after the season. There's a series of games between the Saints and a team called the All-Americas. The All-Americas was managed by the Minneapolis manager, John Barnes, and appeared to be mostly Miller's players with a few others thrown in for good measure. The trip does not prove as lucrative, which defeats the purpose of a barnstorming tour. As was a bit of a theme of the era, liberal use of alcohol and a complete lack of discipline were considered some of the culprits, and we'll see that pop up again when we're talking about the Saints. Preparing for the 1896 season, this was the era of the draft when leagues above could draft players from leagues below, and so there will be a pattern of players being drafted or sold to National League teams, and this is an annual cycle. Before the season, Comiskey brought in several players who would prove to be key parts of his Saints teams. Jack Glasscock, who was a first baseman, had a long major league career. Outfielder Sam Mertz, shortstop Frank Schugert, catcher Henry Spies. These are players who formed the core of some of the Saints teams for this season and some of the seasons coming up. Now, Comiskey had looked to resolve the issue of having to play at 2 grounds, but ended up settling on continuing that arrangement for the 1896 season. But when he returned, when the winter ice skating at Aurora Park had left the field a mess. And so there is the ice doesn't melt very quickly, so the team has to train in Dubuque, Iowa. But they do have their season opener in Milwaukee, and it's won on a walk-off home run in air quotes, because it was actually a case where outfielder Billy George had gotten on base due to a fielding error from Milwaukee's pitcher. Then Glasscock hits a home run to the fence, but he is stopped at second base under the rules of the time when George crossed the plate. So even though he hit what was considered a home run ball, it was only scored a double. But either way, it was an extra inning walk-off win for the Saints in their opener. And then they come home and they won their season opener against Kansas City. I know it was after a rainout because the day before there were plans for a parade. There was bunting all around, but then torrential rains ended up to the game being postponed. So instead of a large crowd, there were only about 1,000 in attendance for that opener. The team gets off to a decent start. They're 12-8, but probably more importantly, they're in second place. So they are among the contenders in early going. And the team just ends up, kind of coasting from that point. They have this June road slump once again, followed by another home rebound. I'll also note that, West Side Park, there was some discussion about possibly trying to prevent Sunday games at West Side Park. That effort fizzled. But one thing I will note is that West Side Park was such that there were a lot of strange scores, even unusual for that era. These look more like football scores and not football scores of that era, but football scores of this era. And one of those scores was a 41-8 win over Minneapolis. So there's a case of really sticking one to your local rivals. And in that game, the Saints left 8 on base. So 41 scored, 27 earned, according to the reports of the game. Also in the middle of the season, Louisville ended up playing an exhibition in St. Paul. And one of the things I remember, I grew up in Omaha, and this was a time when the Kansas City Royals would come and play an exhibition game against the Omaha Royals, and it would be a big deal. And so this was a bit of the similar occasion in that era. However, even though it might sound like a big deal with a National League, a big league team coming to town, and Comiskey had to guarantee their train fare to get them to come. It's worth keeping in mind that this Louisville team was 11-44. They were 55 games into the season and already 26 games out of first place. It was a bad team, and the Saints beat them 11-3. But they do continue their pattern of using a homestand to get back into contention. And so ahead of a 3-week road trip, they are back in second place, and they are very close behind Indianapolis. And this was a season that had a 3-way race. The graphic that that may not show up that well on the right. This was a graphic that appeared in a paper, and you're seeing three men depicted as Indianapolis, Minneapolis, and St. Paul trying to climb to the top of the pole. The Saints did climb to the top of the pole. They got to first place on August 1st. They swept Grand Rapids on the same day that Minneapolis and Indianapolis were playing to a tie. But again, another skid. They have a 6-game skid against Kansas City and Milwaukee, and Comiskey leads to a bit of a tirade against his players. And I'm trying to, when I was reading these quotes, I had sort of like an old-timey voice in my head. Comiskey saying things like, if I had the best 4 pitchers in the business, they could not win games with a lot of quitters laying down behind them. And then just to, continue the theme, I could lose my voice trying to jolly this crowd of quarter horses. They're good runners, they are, on a streetcar. So maybe Comiskey had a drummer behind him going, ba-dump bump. There's no report of that, but he is lashing out. They get back to the Twin Cities, and then just, for good measure, they get swept twice by Minneapolis, swept at their place, then in St. Paul. And by the time the home schedule was completed on September 8th, a team that was in first place just 5.5 weeks before is now 13 games out. Part of it is that Minneapolis got on this amazing tear. I think they won at one point something like 26 out of 27 games. I may be a bit off on that, but they just went on a streak. They end up winning the pennant. The season, for a team that was in first place on August 1st, they finish in fourth place and out of the picture. And Comiskey blaming alcohol, says that there are going to be anti-liquor rules in place for the 1897 season. Just a note about some of the Western League politics of the time and some of the machinations. So the happy little fellow on the right is that's John Brush, who I mentioned. And in the off season, Brush, during the time in the Western League, Brush continued to hold a strong grudge against Ban Johnson. And Brush had helped to put one of his pals at the head of the Minneapolis franchise. So John Goodnow ends up the head of a syndicate that takes over Minneapolis. And so Brush is looking for partners to make some changes to the Western League or possibly break up the Western League to move things more in his direction. Now, the Western League had this rule when they reorganized before the prior season that there were 6 clubs that were considered 5-year members. And so that was Kansas City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Indianapolis, Detroit, and of course, Kansas City. I may have forgotten one, but Columbus and Grand Rapids, those were the 2 that were subject to annual renewal. Columbus also happened to be controlled by a very good friend of Charlie Comiskey and Ban Johnson named Tom Loftus. Loftus had been, for a brief time, a teammate of Comiskey's and becomes an ally of the 2 throughout his at least through the later years. So Brush wants to use this provision that requires annual renewal as a way of maybe installing some of his cronies with two additional franchises in the league and creating more of a 4-4 split among the votes. He ultimately is not successful in that. But the result is that Johnson is reelected as president. And even after all that brouhaha, it ends up being status quo ante as far as the Western League goes. Milwaukee was the 6th other team that was a 5-year member of the league. In the offseason, Charlie Comiskey decided against touring, decides that he wants to stay and run winter carnivals and skating rinks. There's also a game called ice polo that I had not heard of. At first, I thought maybe it was a version of ice hockey, because hockey was somewhat in its infancy at that time as a recognized sport in the U.S. But no, there was a game called ice polo that was played on a very large surface of ice. So I'm just thinking of it as ice hockey on a soccer field. Is the image that I have in mind, but someone can correct me if I have that wrong. In doing so, Comiskey would complain every year about what the ice would do to his field, and how long it took to melt. But it did not dissuade him from turning his grounds into winter carnival grounds in the off season, because I guess where there's a buck to be made, there's a buck to be made. And the first time that he did this, he partnered with E.B. Smith for these carnivals, and they did so at a site called Lexington Park. And this is the Lexington Park site where the Saints of the American Association era would later play. So Comiskey ends up moving to this site for 1897. It's about a mile west of where he had been at Aurora Park. So it's a slightly longer commute for fans, but it also solves his Sunday baseball problem. For those of you who attended Sabre 52 and had went to the St. Paul Saints game on that evening, I had been trying to figure out exactly where these places were located, but on the floor of the museum at the park, there was a very helpful map, which allowed me to pinpoint the locations of these places. And the facilities were also considered a big upgrade. There are a lot of references to the fact that the park had 2,000 opera-style chairs, which in the grandstand, which apparently was a very big deal at the time. And the fans did respond to the new facility. Attendance was up almost a third from the 1896 season. And as for how the 1897 season went, the team got off to another fast start. They had some good luck with respect to player acquisitions in the off season. Chicago, through the National League draft, had drafted outfielder Walt Preston from Minneapolis, and Preston was a key player on that Miller team that won the pennant. But he ended up being released by Chicago, then ended up in St. Paul. Additionally, Comiskey had found this pitcher named Roger Denzer, who had a very good season in 96. He was drafted, but did not have success with Chicago, so we ended up back with St. Paul. The team opened the exhibition season against National League opposition. Results were mixed, but they ended up having a fast start to the season. One of the other acquisitions that Comiskey made was for an outfielder named Algernon McBride, who would end up winning the Western League batting title in 1897. And so these players, powered the Saints to a 27-10 start. They're in first place, ahead of their first road trip, and it helped that they had a long homestand. In the middle, they beat Minneapolis 29-4. As it was reported, it was not a ball game which was played at Exposition Park this afternoon. It was a slaughter of innocents, with Charlie Comiskey's Saints in the role of chief executioners. So the team is in first place by early July. But then, like the year before, there's another team that ends up being hotter than they are. And in this case, it was Indianapolis. Indianapolis was hot. The team couldn't keep up. It ended up finishing in third. I do want to note this incident between pitcher Bill File, who you see there on the right, and Comiskey. They were waiting on the train platform before headed to Milwaukee for the final games of the season. And File decided that was a good time to demand his sobriety bonus for the 1897 season. I'm not sure if he was fueled by any intoxicants in doing so, but he decided to confront Comiskey, and it was ended up living to regret it. Comiskey landed a few blows, and it was also stated that the application of shoe leather put a damper on the twirler's pugilistic aspirations, and that is sports writing, my friends. File also, incidentally, he said that he would never play for Comiskey again after that. He was drafted by Brooklyn, but after things didn't go well in Brooklyn, guess where he ended up? Back in St. Paul. A couple of, just want to throw in some interludes here, so it's not a strictly chronological presentation. In doing some reading for this, for this, I read biographies of Comiskey and Johnson that I could find, and in those times, both before, after the Western League era, going into the American League era, when they weren't feuding with each other, they would go on these hunting trips, and these trips were regularly reported in the newspaper. And some of these trips would take place during the course of the season. Like Comiskey would just, leave the team in charge of, say, Jack Glasscock for the day, and he and Van Johnson would go fishing or hunting in Minnesota. And so then the newspapers would also report on either the meagerness or the heartiness of the bounty that they would bring back. So a bit of a story, and this would continue even when Comiskey and Johnson were both in Chicago. They would do a lot of hunting and fishing in Wisconsin. So getting ready for the 1898 season. So McBride, who had just won the batting title, he ends up being drafted by Philadelphia. So he's gone. And the Western League is, like most businesses, like other baseball leagues at the time, they're facing financial pressures. So there are some salary restrictions that are being put in place. And there were some questions about whether players would sign contracts. But Comiskey had no concern. He said, they'll come around all right. If I closed the gate, you'd find them climbing over the fence to get into the park when practice begins. And the team ends up having, they have a fast start to the season. They got their confidence by pounding some local amateur and college sides. And then they have a fast start to the season, fueled by another long homestand. They're 14-2, and they're in first place. On a road trip to Detroit, Tony Mullane, remember, who had been with Comiskey since the team was formed, or since the team had moved to St. Paul in 1895. he's continuing to lose effectiveness by this point, and so Comiskey sold him to Detroit in late May. But Mullane does resurface later in the season as an umpire. And if you're someone who likes the books that tell the story of a single season, and I do like books that just take a year in time and tell the story of baseball that year. The 1898 Western League pennant race, I think, would be an interesting story to tell, because you have an 8-team league and there were 5 teams that were in the middle of a very tight pennant race, even going into August. All 5 teams are just within a few games of each other. And Comiskey himself got back onto the field during this time. When Jack Glasscock, who was playing first base, when he had to leave to tend to his ailing wife, and then later with some injuries. So Comiskey got back on the field and played some first base. And, I don't know that the sports writers at the time were trying to be insulting. I think they were trying to be respectful. But, there's one game where it notes that, Comiskey just really caught a drive, and it's written, Comiskey hit a long one. It was easily good for a homer, but the magnate's wind isn't as good as it was in the big league. And he was so warm that perhaps clothes did not inspire him with any covetousness of all. So a home run ball that resulted in a double. And then the next day, there was a muffed play, so that puts Comiskey on first base, and the 38-year-old stole a base. And the way it was written up was, the veteran seemed disposed to let well enough alone, but his face was a false one. He was wondering whether he could make second or not. Suddenly, he started away from the sack. And so the sports writer tells the story that he ends up taking the base, but there's a question about whether the second baseman had dropped the ball out of respect for Charlie Comiskey. And so those were the kinds of stories that you would hear. You would read when Comiskey did make a game, and he was such a popular figure that they would also lament that if only fans knew he was going to play that day, that more people would have shown up, because his respect was that great. But many times he was a last-minute replacement for an injured player. So back to the 1898 season, despite Comiskey getting into action, and despite the Saints being in the Twin Cities for the final weeks of the season, their effort at winning the pennant falls short. They finish 81-58 and in 4th place. And I believe this year was Kansas City that came out on top of that 5-team pile. With Comiskey, there was almost annual speculation about his ambitions while he was in St. Paul. There were rumors about him taking a National League managerial post because of his connections to St. Louis and some financial difficulties that the owner of the Browns, Chris Fonderaw, was dealing with in the 1890s, that he might try to take control of the Browns. He was considered one of the richest former players. In fact, there was, speculation around this, throughout the 1890s, occasionally about his net worth, and that number never went down. In addition to, by many accounts, having a profitable team in St. Paul most years, he also had some real estate investments in Chicago that improved his net worth. So there's a feeling that he's going to want to do something else. And my view is that at this time, Comiskey decided that he liked working for himself and was not going to work for anybody else. So I don't think going back into management was necessarily in the cards. But he did back his friend Tom Loftus in a bid for the Browns. That ended up falling through. The team ended up being bought by creditors, who sold the team to the Robeson brothers, who owned the Cleveland National League franchise. And for those of you who've read ahead, they would end up, the Cleveland Spiders would end up being left for dead in the 1899 season, and then they would make their home in St. Louis with a team that was the Browns, but then became the Cardinals around the turn of the century. And at this time, part of what also fueled the speculation is that there is a shifting baseball landscape. It is expected that the National League is going to contract. Remember, this is before the 1899 season. We know that they contract for the 1900 season. But there's thought that teams like Cleveland and Baltimore might be left on the chopping block. There are rumors of new leagues or associations. The revival of the American Association seemed to be almost an annual prediction around this time. And there's a question about where Comiskey is going to be in this reshuffle. Well, things didn't change very much for the 1899 season, but things are about to. And so Comiskey is in St. Paul for one last season. And this ends up being the Saints' worst season during his time there. They actually made some interesting, off-season moves. They brought in Dan Lally, who had some major league outfield experience, I think, with St. Louis, but I might have that wrong. Comiskey also signed a pitcher, Chauncey Fisher, who also had some major league experience and would end up being with the team through later years, along with pitcher Jack Cattell. So the team is a little over 500 before they begin their first road string of the year, but they slip below 500 in early July. And unlike prior Saints teams, they just can't battle their way out of that hole. I'm almost picturing Trey Wilson, the actor in Bull, who is the manager in Bull Durham, complaining about his team lollygagging, where he says they have been batting like schoolboys. Their final home game is on August 30th, and only 900 show up for a loss to Indianapolis. And after the season, despite all the speculation, Comiskey says, "Well, why should I leave St. Paul?" And so before we get to the coda of the St. Paul Saints time, I just wanted a few other interludes, just of things that I found interesting. If Ban Johnson was looking to, have a league where there was greater respect for umpires, I can't say his good friend Comiskey was necessarily doing him favors. There were a number of umpiring incidents over the years. His first season, he blames Charlie Cushman, who you see on the right. That umpire referred to his spiteful work. The team gets a reputation for rough play, for mouthing off. There are incidents in which police have to intervene because the team doesn't leave the field. And there's an interesting story about a game. I'll just tell it real quick. There's a game that if you are interested in the Merkles-Boner game from the 1908 season, there was a game that sort of predated it that had a similar outcome, and that was there at Indianapolis. And at the time, Indianapolis batted first in the top of the ninth, and Indianapolis was trailing 11-5. Chauncey Fisher was on the mound. He gives up 7 runs, stays in the game, gives up 7 runs. Indianapolis is ahead 12-11. Fisher he comes to bat in the bottom half of the inning, and he hits a single that scores a runner. So now the game's 12-12, and Fisher is on first, and Spies is on third. Well, Eddie Burke, outfielder, comes up, drives the ball into right field. Spies crosses the plate, so you think the game's over. Except the Indianapolis right fielder saw that Fisher didn't touch second, so he runs in and appeals to the ump, who called Spies out. Meanwhile, the Saints had left the field and the fans had come onto the field, so the game was a 12-12 tie, and it was disputed for a while. But the St. Paul Globe just noted, when you consider his pitching and his base running performance, Fisher alone was responsible for the result. Also, if there was such a thing as a marketing or a ticket sales department in St. Paul in the 1890s, you would have loved to have had Charlie Comiskey as an owner. He was constantly selling his team, even though he never won a pennant. He was pretty much convinced on an annual basis that he had a pennant winner on his hands. As a player, Comiskey would, he was part-time in his final years in Cincinnati. He had expected to play while he was in St. Paul, but as I mentioned, he played 17 games at first base in 1895, but then really was a fill-in after that. And then just sort of the final part of the tale where we get to the American League. So after the 1899 season, the Western League announced it was changing its name to the American League. It was not yet claiming major league status. Comiskey had said that he was considering new grounds for the team, said, "I have not the slightest intention of leaving St. Paul." Then a week later, it was announced that he was going to relocate to Chicago. It took some time to confirm the move to Chicago, because they had to work out a bit of an understanding with Jim Hart, the president of the Chicago Orphans, who would become the Cubs. The team had agreed that they would only play when the Orphans were out of town. They agreed to just go by White Stockings for that season. But Comiskey does get into Chicago, ends up on the south side. He plays a few blocks away from where he would build Comiskey Park a decade later. The White Stockings finally won a pennant. So if you had been tracking, this team won a pennant the year before they moved to St. Paul, and then they won a pennant the year after they left St. Paul, but never achieved a pennant while in St. Paul. And then the American League completed its configuration, dropping some of its smaller cities, moving out east, and so began the path to the American League. So if you want to check my work, here's a word on sources. And then certainly invite questions, comments now, and welcome any feedback through other means. And Bruce, I'll go ahead and stop sharing so we can all see each other.
Perfect. So if you have a question for our presenter, John Bauer, tonight, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. You'll see another button that says raise hand, and you get in line to ask a question of John Bauer and his expertise on the formation, or I should say, Charles Comiskey's involvement in the formation of the American League. I don't know how to introduce this next character, so I'm just going to go out on a limb here. IP Daily, you're up. How you doing, IP?
Hey, I'm awesome, John. I enjoyed that. I watched. I wasn't at your presentation live in Minneapolis, but I watched because Jacob had put that on there, and I enjoyed seeing it again. Mm-hmm. And I also questioned. I wasn't aware of this game. Do you have the exact date of that Merkel game in 1899? If not now, I can get it from you later.
I get it from me later. I probably have it in my notes, Stu.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was
don't worry about that.
A crazy game. Yeah.
And I don't have much to add, but I'm putting a link into the chat right now. And this is about our ballpark, and it's kind of courtesy of Kerry Smith, a well-known SABR member, who had contacted me because my regular job, I work with a drinking water program at the Minnesota Department of Health. And he had found some permit on water history and water supply with that ballpark. I happened to be at a meeting with somebody from the St. Paul Water Utility. I showed him Kerry's email, and this guy came up with stuff. And I write a lot of feature stories about water for the Department of Health, and anytime I can relate it to baseball, I do. So no, I got thanks, Richard. I've got the Merkel game. I'm looking at the Indianapolis Merkel game, but feel free to click on it. It has to do with water, but it also has to do with the ballpark and a few other things.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks, Stu.
Jim Lurie, you're up. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing great. Great presentation, John. I do have a question. You mentioned the Page Street baseball barnstorming team with Bud Fowler.
The Page Fence Giants. Yeah.
Was there a lot of barnstorming between the Negro players and the white players at this time?
So, not that I saw relative to the Saints, because the Saints this was the only season where I saw that they had played against Negro League teams of that era. Because in other seasons they would have some exhibitions against major league teams or National League teams, and then in some cases they would just beat up on local opposition as a way to get ready for the season. But the games before the 1895 season were the only ones I saw in which the Saints had played against a black opposition. But as for the era, I'm not well versed enough to know how much how broadly the practice was of teams playing against each other, but of white teams and black teams. But this was one example. They also, before they played the Saints, they played the Millers over in Minneapolis. So they had a game or two in Minneapolis before coming over to St. Paul to play the Saints.
Thank you.
There is a book about the Giants written by a Michigan man named Mitch Lutzke. It's Lutzke. And he goes into depth about the Giants and their barnstorming days in the Midwest.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. We appreciate that. Carl Lindholm, you can unmute and you are up. How you doing, Carl?
Thanks.
Good to see you.
I mean, many questions, and I'll really limit myself. Thanks very much for you're a guy from New Hampshire, live, freeze, and die, and that's their motto: live, freeze, and die.
Yeah, well, I'm actually a native Midwesterner. I moved here 6 years.
That's actually sort of my question, the first one, anyways. I live in Vermont and I come from Maine, and the worst thing about that is you have to drive through New Hampshire, But
hey.
And you're a Giants fan. I'm married to a woman who teaches at Middlebury College, and she worked three summers for the San Francisco Giants, running their message board. So she's a Giants fan living in Vermont. How the hell did you become a Giants fan if you're from the Midwest and you live in New Hampshire?
So the story is this. Growing up in Nebraska, when it comes to sports, everyone is raised to be a Husker football fan. And this is non-negotiable. But when it comes to pro sports, we're all free agents. So even though I didn't really latch onto the Royals, even though I moved to Kansas City in the 90s and then latched onto them. But growing up, I was more of a National League guy. And when I started reading about baseball history when I was 12, 13, a lot of the early 20th century had to do with the New York Giants and John McGraw and those great teams. And I just became really attracted to baseball history and then became attracted to the Giants through that. It also turned out that the Giants had a lot of players in the late 80s that I had really liked. Guys like Will Clark that I saw at the College World Series, which is played every year in Omaha when he was with Mississippi State. Also guys like, Robbie Thompson, Kevin Mitchell. So I just latched onto them. And it was also
Krukow and the catcher. Who was the catcher who was so great for that team? Managed the Diamondbacks. I'm interrupting, but that was a great time.
Bochy?
No, it was it's my wife's favorite.
Brenly.
Brenly.
Character. Anyway, sorry.
I was going to say Man-Waring, but he was later. Yeah.
Yeah, he's from New York State. Anyway, I interrupted, and I apologize.
Oh no,
but so that's Giants. I won't interrupt again. The Giants.
Oh no, yeah. So I'm a Giants fan, which also when I was living in the Midwest, having young kids, the games in San Francisco would start around 9:15 Central Time. So that was perfect for me because we would get the kids down by about 9:00. And then I could sit down and watch the Giants.
I'll, if you don't mind, Bruce, I have another comment or two. If that's
my guest, Carl. It's good to see you tonight. Fans, be my guest.
Merkel's Boner. Here in Vermont, the high school baseball championship was decided this past year on a Merkel's Boner play.
Really?
Where the bases were loaded, a guy hit a ball, the kid came home, and the kid from first never went to second at all. It's a terrible rule. That's what I come up with. And the Middlebury high school team won the state championship against another team on a Merkel's Boner play. And I just don't understand. This is not a time for a discussion of that. It's a whole different book or article. Yeah. Why it's a rule at all. Anyway, and there's some wonderful accounts in a book called Havana Heat which gives a great description. It's actually fiction of Merkel's Boner and a couple of others. But the other question, the larger question is, and I'll end with this, is it's a very esoteric presentation, and quite detailed. I only know Comiskey from his sort of larger profile, and of course which is underscored by his role in the Black Sox saga. What's your sense of Comiskey overall as a historical figure? Is he a giant, or is he a prick?
I would say that I don't know that he was any more of a prick than some of the other owners of that era. But I think that some of the image of him that we got from 8 Men Out, which even though in many ways I joke that 8 Men Out is a work of fiction, yet every time I stumble across it while channel surfing, I'll watch it.
Yeah.
That I think we know that maybe some of the myths of him, and I think especially through the work done by the Black Sox committee, have been debunked.
Yes.
But he certainly, even though he was part of the Players League, the revolt of the players in 1890, he definitely grew into his role as a baseball magnate, as they were called at the time. And so I don't have the impression that he suffered fools, but I don't have the impression that he was necessarily any better or any worse than his contemporaries.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. A very nice presentation. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
I always wanted to be a magnate, and I always fell short. It's a shame. I mean, geez. Anything else?
Powell Crosley was a refrigerator magnate.
There you go. There you go.
Well, Bruce, you weren't a magnate, but you were a magnet, a chick magnet. So,
Ooh.
right?
Ooh, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
You do know my wife's on the call, right? Right,
I do.
girl?
That's why I said it.
Okay.
Hal Crosley, cars, TVs. He did a number of.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right. Well, we're going to be back Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. with another special presentation brought to you by the East Coast Cooperative. Our guest will be another Saber 52 presenter, Steve Treater, who will give his presentation, The Giants, the A's, and Silicon Valley. The sign-up link was sent out this morning in our Monday message and is available in the Saber events calendar. So don't delay, sign up. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our uploads. And if you're not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, Saber boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to saber.org/join today. John Bauer, you are fantastic. Great presentation, my man. Thanks a lot. Go.
I just want to put in a plug. If you did not see Steve's presentation from Saber 52, either live or through a recording, make time to see it. It was outstanding.
Yeah, he was great. He was great. He'll be Wednesday night at 7. Like I say, the link is in the events calendar now. Once we end, go sign up for that presentation. John, thanks a lot.
Thank you for your
Thanks, everyone.
All
right. Good night.
Thank you for your
Let's get everybody out of here so they
hospitality.
can watch the Yankees. Have a good night, everybody.